Con voi and welcome to our video. We are here with Stambecco, con te Stambecco, con te, con voi. So we are here with Stambecco Pesco that lives and works in Damanhur. He's a spiritual researcher and one of the teachers of Damanhur University, and he's also a writer who's published several books. But we are here to talk about one book in particular called Falco Tarassaco, The Dream, The Message. But Stambecco, if you want to introduce yourself, maybe you can also tell us the other books you wrote, and you can tell us something about your experience in Damanhur. Of course. So just like many other Damanhurians, in Damanhur I had lots of different roles and functions. Writing is something I did both inside and outside of Damanhur. And in the years I wrote and published books about different topics, from inner harmonization to the planet Earth. Or I also worked together with other authors to write about religious and spiritual freedom in Italy. And I dedicated the last few years in particular to talk about Falco and to write about Falco because he's an important figure, important not just for me and in my life, but I think he's a figure that needs to be talked about and explored. I think he's a very interesting and exciting character for writers. Yes, and I'm actually really happy to be here for this interview and to be able to interview you because Falco is someone that we briefly talked about in our videos, but we haven't really explored him in details. But today is finally the moment to do it. And so I want to ask you, maybe to start this interview, if you can tell us who Falco was for you and how you would introduce him, because I read in the first pages of the book that he didn't like to be called spiritual master. So how would you introduce him, and what would you say about him to let us understand who he was? Well, Falco is my spiritual master. Then the fact that he didn't particularly like to be called that is a different thing, which is part of his message and part of his teachings. Falco would often say, just like life is a long, long school that goes from 0 to 100 years, a spiritual path needs someone to show you the way at first. A companion that has already walked through that path, and so that knows it. But then you have to walk through it yourself. So I'm not a master, rather I'm a guide. He preferred to be called spiritual guide because you have to walk through the path. You can't just follow him. You have to do your own thing. You have to walk through your path. So he's this for me from a different point of view, maybe from a different perspective. He's the biggest bet of my life because I decided to be inspired by him. And so I decided to bet on him. And Falco talks about a world that's not just a visible world, and it's not just the world that you can experience in your everyday life. So it's also a world that's connected to something that goes beyond the points of matter. And so the bet also means an investment of trust. And so an investment in trusting lots of aspects that go well beyond the 5 senses. And so for example, from my personal background, I come from a background that's definitely not aligned with this kind of more spiritual approach to life. It's more of a scientific type of background, but by knowing Falco and then the first Damanhurians, I immediately felt that I was interested to explore this alternative vision of the world, and so I'm here to talk about it. Falco is no longer here with us, but in some ways he's always present. Well, you talked about spiritual guide, that's what you said, and so maybe to start exploring the vision of Falco's spiritual message, of course spiritual in the Damanhurian world, what would you describe this? I mean, you called them spiritual guide. Well, spiritual from our point of view means being in the direction of life and moving towards this type of direction. So being inside of a path inside of which everything that's part of your being and of the conditions that you're going to meet and of the others and of the other life forms that you are going to interact with and that you're going to connect with, that all of this is connected and that all of this is part of the same plane, part of the same project, and we give meaning to all of this. Being inside of a spiritual path means desiring and reading and discovering and being able to give meanings to everything that exists around us, from the fact that we are constantly communicating with the others, or the fact that we also communicate with plants and the other living forms, and learning that nature contains so much knowledge and experience. And also, it's about the fact that everything that represents the myth of so many different peoples and civilizations, everything that's part of the history, the stories, the tales and legends, so everything that goes beyond the physical plane, in this sphere, in this sector and field, there's so much that needs to be learned and discovered, undercovered, unveiled, and all of this is spiritual. So giving meanings to all of these aspects and then being able to build a path that goes beyond the schemes and that creates a new path. The metaphor of the companion that walks with you and next to you, as I was using it before, he's really someone that shows you the path and that walks through it with you, but then you build it for yourself and by yourself. In the first pages, you also talk about something that Falco really often talked about, so this desire for research, and then you also talk about happiness. Now, the research and the spiritual path, so this concept of building your own path, building your own trail, basically, is also connected to this desire to research more, to ask questions. It's connected to the concept of doubts and where do you place happiness in this? Well, research is a fundamental aspect, because when I start to do a work to connect with all of these things that I constantly discover, I acquire data, information, I explore worlds I didn't know before, and all of this expands my possibilities, my limits. 5 senses used to be used always for the same things, that suddenly discover more shades, more colors. Then it means that these 5 senses in reality become 6, 7, 8, that they're all more connected between each other, and they let you discover lots of different ways to sense things, ways that are maybe not necessarily connected with modern science, but ways that can help you explore different things. And so researching means lots of different things. It means, for example, just studying from books, but also studying and having experiences in groups of researches, so together with the others. And in Damanhur, really, there's no limit when it comes to the research. Everything can potentially be a field of research, and so researching is not something that simply allows you to know more, which is already something important, but it's something that allows you to multiply your tools, the tools that you can use to then know. Researching is something that continues to improve the tool of research, which is the ethic Damanhurian path, the most important thing. I think that's a very fascinating topic and aspect. And so here I'd like to also connect the concept of freedom, because the concept of freedom in spiritual paths and spiritual ways, especially when it comes to the figure of a master, how can we introduce this? Where can we put it? The concept of spiritual freedom. What kind of value does it have? So does it start from the concept of free will? So in this connection of exchange also with this figure of the spiritual master, of the spiritual guide, where can we find the spiritual freedom? Maybe it's also about learning yourself how to feel and pay more attention to what you experience yourself. So how would you describe this? How would you talk about it? So in answering, I actually have to connect with my previous answer. So about happiness, because I forgot to answer that. Well, happiness is a choice. The idea of happiness for Falco is that it's not a passive element that you just suddenly find yourselves into because of whatever reason, because of whatever situation. So you don't just find yourself immersed in it. It's something that you choose to live and choose to experience. Of course, starting from the things you have and the things you care about, but also starting from the interpretation that you want to assign to these things. Giving meanings, assigning meanings, also means being able to understand which is the meaning of sadness, of problems, which are also part of life. Living inside of a spiritual path doesn't mean just living in a happy cloud. It means living inside of the matter and then choosing to do this with a spirit that enriches you and that moves you towards happiness, a conquered, but most importantly, a happiness that you choose for yourself. So freedom is the closest concept to choice. Freedom doesn't mean being able to do whatever you want in all kinds of situation and with everyone. It means choosing the limits or the frame that we move inside of, choosing the discipline rather than rule, because I don't really like the word rule, but choosing the discipline that you're going to move inside of. And inside of this discipline, that's where you can express your creativity. That's where you can express also your ability to create new fields. And that's where you can express the ability to share strength with the others. And in this, Falco maybe would often also help you find your own way, or what kind of relationship did he have with you and also with you as a people of Damanhur? So how would he intervene? Well, Falco wasn't just an extremely intelligent, smart person. From his point of view, he was actually able to basically read you, and at the same time, in reading you, he was able to discover your ancient roots and your hidden talents. And Falco was the biggest, I'd say, the biggest person that would encourage you to discover and explore your hidden talents. And so he would say, I am just going to share with you my points of view, and I'm going to tell you the stories I believe are important to then help you find your own ways and your own paths. And I can give you some personal directions and some personal suggestions if you ask me about them, if you want them, and then if you actually use them. If I give you a suggestion, then I expect you to use it. Then of course you're also free to not use it, but then don't ask me for more. And this too is an aspect of freedom. Freedom means choosing to ask. I have the right to ask and I have the right to receive an answer, but then I should also pay attention to what I'm being told. So he knew how to be extremely generous from this point of view. And it's a type of generosity that's very particular, meaning that with his students, with his disciples, maybe we can use this other word, he would often let you establish the distance. So he would let you establish the type of connection and relationship and distance that you had with him. So he wouldn't get too close to you and he wouldn't get too far from you. So he would just let you establish your own distance from him. So if someone were to decide to be emotionally dependent to him, he wouldn't just disappear. Maybe he would encourage them to change this type of relationship, and so he would help them find other messages, and so help them understand, well, it's not exactly necessary to depend on him, but he was always open and available to hear everyone's suggestions and needs. And the same thing also goes for those people that maintained more distance and were a bit colder towards him. So he would often let you decide and establish your distance from him. In the book, he also divided different chapters and connected the chapters to specific topics and maybe some of his messages. So at some point, you also talk about the topic of the group and the idea of group. I think that Damanhur as a reality as an experience is very connected to this idea of group. And so Falco's idea eventually led to this type of communitarian experience. And so, what kind of impact did this have on you and also on his teachings? Because the group, the others, living together, what can you say about this? Well, the aspect of the group, of the community, the aspect of sharing is a fundamental pillar for what concerns Falco's message and ideas. Falco would often say, you do things together, you think about these things together, you share them, and you try to create connections that go beyond simple kindness and that really become true empathy. Also, kindness is something that he would often talk about, because even the difficult things, difficult to say or to talk about, they can be shared, and you use kindness for that. So he would often pay a lot of attention to how we would say things or how we would talk about things. So he would often privilege this type of approach, kinder words. And so he would say, we build together group entities, and together we can build super individuals or collective spheres. And so in these spheres, the intelligence of the group ends up being a lot more creative, and it's a lot more open and willing to move and then affront the events that life presents you. But also with this addition, he talked about Damanhur and then the Federation of Communities he founded, and said Damanhur is always going to be a community of individuals. So you don't arrive here in this community to just protect yourself and to no longer feel the need to grow as individuals. No, you're part of this community to grow as individuals, and you're all responsible for your own personal growth. And this is then what's going to allow the entire collectivity to also grow. And so I also saw that you dedicated an entire chapter to this, to the personal growth, which today is still something that we often talk about. And so about this concept of personal growth, what do you think Falco's approach was? I mean, what was his philosophy about this? And also, what was his style, his teaching style? What would he often talk about? Maybe what I read between the lines is his idea of living the moment. So what were the main ingredients of his teachings? So personal growth is something that connects with the ability to be able to fully live every moment and every instant of time and of life. There is no such thing as important moment and not important moment. And there's not such thing as more spiritual moments and less spiritual moments. Of course, there's moments in which the experience, or moments that are dedicated, for example, to meditation. And so in these moments, you pay maybe more attention to a specific type of perception. But this moment in which I am here talking about my book with you is not less spiritual than a moment in which maybe I'm crossing my legs and breathing for 10 minutes. And I just do that. They're both spiritual and equally spiritual. So personal growth is about being able to create and maintain harmony and continuity and coherence between all of these moments. So it's about being able to live every moment and to live them fully with passion and participation, and at the same time also with detachment, which doesn't mean with coldness, but it means that I can still be myself regardless of what is happening in that moment, and I am not going to be influenced by the outcome and the result of my action, but I'm going to be connected more with the way I completed this action. And this is something that I can use in terms of approach in my everyday life, also in how I approach the others. And it's something that gradually leads me to discover all of those things that we mentioned at the beginning, all of those things that make a difference. And so make a difference between a path of life and a spiritual path. And so maybe this is connected with the Damanhurian slogan, or this Damanhurian idea that the meditation is something that happens 24/7. And so maybe the concept of community is also connected with the idea of creating a social context in which you can experience in your everyday life. So all day, every day, this that you were talking about. So from the moment you wake up and maybe you cook with the others, to when you work together on the territory, this is all spiritual.